morning. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be presenting alongside so many clever people. As Sergey said, my name is Martyn. I set up and currently run the user experience team at Virgin Atlantic. And I have some stuff that I've learned over the years and some stuff that I've been thinking about recently that's connected to user experience and marketing that I wanted to share with you all. Some of it you may agree with, some of it you may not, but hopefully there's something in there that everyone can take a little bit away from. So I wanted to start off with this quote from Paul Adams. If you're not already following Paul on Twitter and on Medium and all the other places that he kind of outputs to, I strongly recommend that you do so. I like this quote because it frames the kind of point that I wanted to bring today, which is that we should stop treating marketing and design or user experience like they're different things when they are in fact actually just different sides of the same coin. I like this quote. I think it encapsulates an awful lot and it makes me sound cleverer than I actually am. When Sergey invited me to talk today, I'll be honest, I really had sort of no idea about how I would do this, how I would share anything that you guys would think would be valuable. And the name The School of UX is sort of intimidating. What on earth have I got to say at the School of UX? But I thought about my experiences of learning and education, and I came to realize that a lot of what I had learned and how I had learned and my place within the UX world and how I got to where I am came from understanding what had gone before me to help me grow my understanding of how things have developed and why things are the way they are today. So I thought today we'd take a look at that. So I think it's important to recognize as a start point that user experience, UX design, is still relatively young. When we look at it in the grand scheme of things, although the notions of user experience design and some of the things that influence it have been around for many years, the term user experience, the term UX has only been around, I mean, the earliest references I could find to it as a discipline were back in 2003 compared to things like the first references to a book designer, 1830. So it's still very young in the scheme of things. And when we look back at other design disciplines, when we look back at other things that bear parallels to UX, we can see the paths that they've walked, we can see how they have gone to terms with their formation, with their popularization, with how they have learned to scale, with how they've found their place in the world, found their own languages, and how they've done lots of these things and grown into these industries long before we have. But we're still young and many businesses are still struggling to understand user experience and where it sits inside those organizations. Over the course of my career, I've worked in user experience roles, and those have sat inside marketing teams, inside technology teams, even inside operations teams. I'm sure that many of you out there today are in user experience roles and inside marketing functions or inside technology functions, and I think it's just a symptom of how mature the industry actually is. So we're all still young. And perhaps just a little bit immature along the way. You know, we're still arguing over what we should call things and how we describe things. But we're growing fast and we're all learning lots. But like all adolescents, we're beginning to understand our place in the world and beginning to understand the grander picture. But why does any of this matter? Why does this matter to user experience? Right? We're all superheroes, right? We've got amazing superpowers. What on earth can these dusty old design disciplines possibly teach us? And how does this relate to marketing and user experience? This image is a still from a film called The Matrix Reloaded. Has anyone seen this film? No? Okay. It's not a great film, but it serves for a good metaphor for today. On the left side, we have our hero, and he has discovered his new superpowers, right? He is the one. And he can see things more clearly than other people. He's developed a superhuman way of seeing the world that helps him bend and shape the things around him. He's aware of how the world is put together, and with his new superpowers, he's going to change the world for the better. Over there on the right, that guy with the amazing hair and suit in the chair is the architect. So in this scene, it's revealed to our dashing hero that his superpowers are not new, and that he is not the first savior, or the first one to discover these powers. And in fact, actually, there has been many ones before him. You see where I'm going with this already. So this scene is supposed to be a shocker, it's supposed to be a revelation, it's much like how I'm stretching out this metaphor. So today I'm here to tell you that you are not the first ones. We are not the first design discipline to walk this path. Many of the things that we're discovering today have been discovered before. Now, I don't want to undermine any of the wonderful things that's happening in our community right now, but we should not fall into the trap of thinking that what we're doing is 100% new. Many of the ideas that we're exploring have come from marketing. Many of the problems that we're trying to figure out have already been solved by people who are working in marketing. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn. That was a lot of sweeping statements. So I'm going to now look at some of the things that make user experience special. Some of the things that are getting a lot of focus right now, some of the hot topics around our industry. I'm going to take you through each one of them and show you how they can relate to elements that have existed previously and currently exist within the history of marketing. So DesignOps. This is a big one right now. Silicon Valley is actively building groups of specialists who are focused on the production and the discipline of facilitating design as opposed to the creation of design. Understanding how design systems, design programs and tools can be scaled, and recognizing that as a distinct discipline of its own. We've seen companies like Pinterest set up entire departments for design ops. Airbnb are also very hot on this subject, and they're open sourcing a lot of their tools. It's a hot topic, a lot of people are talking about it, but marketing have been here before. This is the legendary branding agency Unimark, photographed in their office in New York, 1966. For those of you up on your design history, the guy with his arms folded in the black there is Massimo Vignelli, titan within the graphic design world. He went on to brand American Airlines. He created the design system for the New York subway. I love this picture. I love most things about this picture. I love the fact they've got their work on a table. I love the fact they're all wearing white coats because they could probably just get away with saying anything. There's a lot of good stuff going on in this picture. But the thing I wanted to point out is the guy over on the far side, that is Robert Moldovsky, and he was the studio manager for Unimark. He was responsible for running the design team. He was not responsible for designing, he was responsible for the running of the studios. He was responsible for the processes, for the tools, whatever that was in the 60s, probably great rulers, I don't know. Collecting libraries, he was responsible for the contracts and everything. He was doing design ops. Most of what Unimark set out in its time went on to define standards for branding and marketing agencies. Even today, lots of the things that they were discovering are standard practices and things that you will see every day within brand agencies, within marketing functions. Their attention to hardware and software, their ideas around bespoke typography, their notions of recording and archiving libraries of explorations and research and their own work. A lot of these same principles are what we're seeing today emerging and forming around design ops within UX. And it has its differences, but it's fundamentally about the process of design rather than the execution of it. So in time, the studio manager role developed. The practical running of design teams from its inception back in the 60s eventually splintered entirely away from the creative side. The practice of managing design became a practice in itself, much like DesignOps is already doing today. This foundation then led on to becoming known as design management. Even today, you can still get degrees. There's a whole number of universities in London that are still doing degrees in design management. So if design ops is an area that you are interested in, if it's something that's part of your jobs already, then you might want to consider how these evolved into general management. Now, if you think that that's a bit of a tenuous path and something that's perhaps not already happening and distant from the user experience, I'd ask you to take a look at Julie Zhu, who is the product design lead for Facebook. She has released her first book at the end of last year, which was a general management book. Cap Watkins, the VP of design for BuzzFeed. Cap has left BuzzFeed now and is now a general management consultant. These things are already happening within user experience. These paths are already being laid out and following the same formation that we saw starting back here in Unimark in the 60s. UX research. It's the U in UX, right? It's one of the things that make us so special. Research puts us in the shoes of our users. Its value is well understood, I think, in this room. Many of us think that it's what separates us from other disciplines, though. Whilst it is very important, I recognize that. This is David Ogilvy. How many people know David Ogilvy? How many people are aware of his work? There's a few. There's a few in there. This guy was an absolute icon in the advertising world. Many people think a lot of the stuff that you may have seen through the Mad Men TV series was directly from stories, fairy tales of how this guy led his life and his agency. A lot of the things that he did have utterly changed the face of advertising as we know it today, particularly around test and learn campaigns. But more relevant than that, he started his agency, Ogilvy and Mather, in 1949. In 1952, he established the in-house research department at Ogilvy, purely to observe how people's behaviors were affected by advertising, how people felt about their products, and then feeding that directly into the creative process. He had a creative team and he had a research team. They sat next to one another and they fed one another. It was one of the first agencies to hire full-time researchers. And from that, Ogilvy was able to make quite profound statements about how people think and feel, not just in relation to advertising. At the time, they were called motivational researchers, a great name. And it's something that he took very seriously and he championed for a long time. In his book, Ogilvy on Advertising, he was quoted as saying, "Advertising people who ignore research are as dangerous as generals who ignore decoded messages from their enemies." It's pretty powerful words. And at the time, it focused on a lot of focus groups, which obviously have their drawbacks in today's world. But then it progressed on to looking at what motivates people, which in turn then led to creative strategies. So a lot of the research that existed at those points then started to form into declarations of a strategy, which then went on to inform creative decisions. Today, there's very few agencies that would ever dare run or launch or try and sculpt a campaign without a strategist on board, giving them insights, giving them direction, setting the overall tone and finding their place within the market. Opening up the ideas of motivations and strategies and tying that to research is something which the UX community is not necessarily always doing. And in the current model, we tend to have research that takes up to a point of saying, here's the insight, here's the things that we've observed, and then it's the designer's path, journey, responsibility, whatever you want to call it, to try and act on that. So if UX research is a field that you're particularly interested in, if it's something which you're pursuing, or if it's your role currently and you're interested in how it may or may not evolve, I think it's worth taking a look at marketing and seeing how it's evolved through their points and into creative strategies. UX writing, sometimes known as content design, depending on which side of the Atlantic you happen to be on. At Virgin Atlantic, we call it UX writing. Steadily, the UX community is starting to see the value in the partnership with design and content and starting to realize how having design and content separate or having one without the other leaves a sense of deficiency and inaccuracy in the things that we're creating. The things that we're creating become more of an abstraction and more of a concept without those two things married up. UK-based organizations like the Gov team, like Deliveroo, like I said at Virgin Atlantic as well, are starting to create that connection. And it's proving more and more important. How many people here, by the way, consider themselves to be a designer? How many people consider themselves to design as part of their job? It's a lot, right? How many people here consider themselves to be content specialists? This guy right here. That's a lot of lorem ipsum right there in the room today. This is becoming more and more significant. And new ways of working are starting to emerge, thankfully with less Latin in. This is Bill Bernbach, 1949. Bill formed BBDO, a fantastically successful marketing agency which still exists today. He pioneered the breaking down of the divide between design and content, and he ultimately went on to change the face of how marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns are structured and formed into a standard model which is called art and copy, which in itself is just a wonderful statement. So it was kind of the other way around in those days, actually. So when you look at some of the early advertising examples, it was almost impossible to distinguish them from articles. They were just full blocks of copy, and Bernbach started to realize, actually, when you introduce design and art direction into these things, they become that much more rich. The story that they're trying to tell can be told partly visually and partly by words, and complementary to one another. And so they steadily introduce visual design into the process. And so this concept that we have today of art direction or design direction wouldn't have existed without his work in this field. But over time, this eventually transformed into just what simply be called creative teams. So inside ad agencies and inside marketing agencies and brand agencies alike today, they're just creative teams. Now, they don't necessarily always have to distinguish between you're doing the words and I'm doing the pictures. So it's starting to already look like product teams, right? It's already starting to look like the multidisciplinary teams that we have in place today within user experience, because these are interconnected disciplines. They're entirely conjoined. If you went to any website and stripped out all the content, it's boxes and colors and an occasional photo. It doesn't serve the same purpose to the users. Equally, if you went around the other way, it becomes just a PDF on a page. So creative teams soon became the standard model within advertising agencies, and they're so ingrained now that ad agencies and marketing agencies usually blur the lines in them. Art directors study language. Copywriters start to understand semiotics. So it goes to show, I think, that from our early stages of understanding how we plug product teams together, that we have a lot that we could potentially learn from marketing and the history of marketing and how that's evolved. Design systems. Got to have a design system. Everyone's got a design system, right? Very hot topic at the moment. You can't scale without one. You need to create a pattern library. It gives you consistency, blah, 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 blah. Hot topics. We're not allowed to talk about that. So lots of designers now think that they've created this new way of designing things, right? This is this new burgeoning thing. Oh, we're not going to do layouts anymore. It's going to be design systems. Everyone loves it. It's great, but it has been done before. Gerald Barney's work, 1965, the British rail system. This is a very, very beautiful piece of work. Not the rail system, that's rubbish. The design of all the entities that went around it is a very, very beautiful piece of work. If you have the opportunity to go to any of the exhibitions or grab any of the books about it, I strongly recommend that you do so. There's nothing in this system. There's nothing in there that Barney's team created that refers to brand language. There's nothing in there that talks about a brand strategy and a position within the market. This is a series of components that can be compiled in a number of different formats to suit a number of different contexts in order to create something that has a degree of consistency, has a degree of accessibility, and standardizes lots of practices. It's a design system, right? It allowed people from lots of other organizations, as you probably can imagine, the rail system was in no better state then than it is now. There was lots of supporting organizations, and they needed to plug into it and make it look like they were all part of a cohesive system. And that was a key part of what went into the work. It is a very exceptional piece of work. Back in the 60s, they didn't use the same terms, though, necessarily. They didn't say components. They didn't talk about atoms and those kinds of things that we do today. They called it an identity manual, and I think it actually was a printed out physical manual. And then that kind of came on to start evolving into brand platforms, brand identities. The term brands and branding was popularized around the 80s. Today, pretty much every marketing team, every advertising team knows their way around a brand system and a brand library and a brand identity. These are pretty common terms. In the last, 15, 20 years, though, those things have started to evolve and started to move forward in their thinking. What were once tightly controlled identities that all had to look exactly the same have now started to move towards a notion of becoming a creative platform. And open platforms that allow and in fact encourage people to be creative on top of them while still sticking within the confines of the system, and so it still works. AOL is a very good example. They had a couple of elements within their identity which were very particular and had to be controlled very tightly. Everything outside of that was encouraged to be developed and changed and played with. Even Apple always get held up as the bastion of branding, right? Lots of people like to talk about how well they control their identity. But have you noticed on all of their event invites, every time they do one of their kind of grand unveilings, they have the invite and it's always got an Apple logo in there some way, but it's always different. It's always someone playing with it. Sometimes it's 3D, sometimes it has background, sometimes it's just a close-up section of it. They're developing these ideas into new and interesting ways. So it makes you think about the work that we're doing today with design systems and how keen we are to lock everything down and find that consistency and ensure that everything is tightly controlled. When in actual fact, perhaps what we should start moving towards is opening them up and finding ways to create platforms out of them. So I should start to wrap up now. So when you start to look at these, each of these things that are happening within our industry, is you start to look at the things that are mattering to people and the things that are occupying people's times and blog posts and Twitter feeds and whatever. And you look at them against the history of marketing and advertising and designing and all the things that sit under the broad umbrella of marketing. You can see that there's lots of opportunities for us to take from them and build upon them. So as we head into the future of user experience and you, the designers, the creators of the future and of the digital world start to move forward, you can do it with the knowledge and the comfort that other people have done it before and other people have solved lots of the things that you're struggling with and trying to learn. There are lots of answers out there in the marketing world that we can make good use from. So I wanted to sort of throw in some book recommendations and stuff to fill your heads. If there's other things that you want to go on to learn about, these are 3 fantastic books that you can start with. If you're only going to pick one of them, I would recommend Ogilvy on advertising. It's an incredible piece of work. Even if you're not that interested in advertising, it's a fascinating social study of a guy who, let's just say, made full use of his life. And the drinks cabinet, probably. But if books and reading and blog posts isn't the thing that you want to do, you can perhaps just mainline a bunch of Mad Men on Netflix. It's incredibly accurate from what I can tell from these books and the history work that I've done. And it'll point to a bunch of stuff that you can derive, and I think that you'll start to see similarities in your work from. So I'm going to leave you with this quote. Harry Truman, who may or may not have been a dubious character, said this very clever thing, which I think is very important and good for us to consider today. He said, "There is nothing new in the world except the history that you don't know." Thank you very much.